listening to It Came From the Radio. You know this is Dr. Feldy, aka L Man, aka Jennifer Elyse Feldman. I'm here with Kevin McLaughlin. He is a producer, director, writer. He does many things. And he just produced a documentary film called Riot, One City's 50-year struggle to leave behind its worst week ever. This documentary is set to go nationwide on public TV in the upcoming months. Simply, Riot is about the 1967 riots in Newark that lasted for 5 days, consisting of bloody fighting, killed 26 people, and $1 million of damage. Now, it's 2024, as most of us know. Why produce a film about 1967?
Well, thank you for asking that. There's a very good reason is that unfortunately we haven't really learned our lessons from 50, 60 years ago, and these kind of conflicts are still taking place. So my hope was to do a number of things, including get people to think as we move forward about how these kinds of conflicts can be avoided and also to learn from what happened there. It's a story of not just of those 5 days, but
Mhm.
of the all the years that followed and all the ways that the city and its surroundings were changed by what happened that week.
Right. Which I have to watch it to find out all the nuance from you. So I'm looking forward to getting educated. I've only seen the trailer. It's coming out soon, 2025, right?
Right, that's the plan.
Right.
It's going to be distributed through NETA, which is the National Educational Telecommunications Association,
Hmm.
and they make it available to all the member public TV stations around the country. And we have to convince them to run it. I know
Gotcha.
they'll run it in the Newark area, and hopefully it will be seen all around the country. Um,
Right.
the big hurdle between now and there is that I've got to raise some money from sponsors to
Which we're
get it
going to
on.
get to at the
Yeah,
end.
yeah.
Yes. I want to get more into the meat and potatoes of what you actually did. And then we can talk about the sponsors, which I'm curious about as well. So now this all happened in 1967. A lot of people from the 90s, even people born in the 90s, have passed. So there's not that many people left. Now, how did you select people to obtain information from? Because, many people who were actually there at this rebellion or riot, which who knows what we should call it really. It must be difficult to find people who are actually there. So who was actually willing to share information and what kind of information did they divulge?
Well, it's one of the reasons I was drawn to this is because I kind of grew up in the shadow of it in the aftermath in Newark. And my dad was a fireman in the city, so he was directly involved and knew a lot of other people who could talk about it. So that was my entree to the topic. And I had been kicking around this idea for a couple of years and was having a drink with my dad and a couple of his friends who were retired firemen. And I mentioned this, and one of them said something that really stuck with me. He said, "Well, if you're going to do it, you better do it soon
Right.
because these people are dying."
Exactly. Yeah.
And so that got me motivated to get going. And I went through my dad and the Retired Police and Firearms Association to get the first responders response and politicians, sociologists,
Mhm.
historians, and gathered them bit by bit. The hardest part was just finding ordinary citizens who had lived through it because there's no
Mm.
association for those people. But
Right.
through a lot of digging and just word of mouth, I managed to contact quite a few interesting people who had interesting stories about what happened back then.
If the people back then were checking in on Facebook and geotagging their photos, you'd be able to find them quite easily. So
Right.
I'm sure that anyone making a documentary on the riots now or rebellions, next question, will not have such a difficult time. We could probably just go through public records to see where they were.
Right. There is surprisingly little material from that on the scene because of course
Hmm.
nobody had a video camera. Most people there, didn't even have a still camera or would
Hmm.
even think of shooting pictures of that. And even the news stations had a minimal ability to cover it. I discovered in
Oh,
researching this, going through news footage, that in those days, most of the TV news photographers were actually still photographers and they didn't really know how to shoot
oh,
moving pictures. So you have a
that's
lot of
interesting.
very, very short clips, like they would roll 3 seconds of film and stop.
Right.
And I
Or
think
just take a photo.
they were sent out with one roll of film for the whole day and they had to make it last. So
Oh,
they would shoot
yes,
very
yes.
short things. Plus,
Very.
back in those days, there was all shot on film. And what they ran on the news in the evening was literally that film cut and edited to show. And so now, years later, that film is still all cut up. So I had to find pieces and try to string them back together.
Right, very interesting, which I'm sure you're capable of, taping together or untaping and checking out the fine details on film in a dark room with lots of dust. I'm sure you could do it if anyone could.
Well, thank you. That was, was part of the process was just mostly came from ABC.
Hmm.
I spent weeks there just going through their archives, which are not as well organized as you might hope. And in fact,
Wow.
between the time I selected footage and they gave it to me, they lost some of it.
Oh,
So those are things
what?
that are not in the film.
Oh,
But
wow. Hmm.
that's the biggest expense that I need to cover now is to get ABC paid for providing that footage.
Gotcha, gotcha. So before we go to that, I have two more questions about the content. Now, kind of going back, the film's about a series of events that happened in 1967, a long time ago. Now, just to make it super clear, why should anyone outside of Newark be interested? Why should anyone on the other coast care what's going on the East Coast back then?
Well, it's because unfortunately these kind of things happen all over the world, really. It's
Hmm.
particularly in the United States. And somebody said to me that idea that why should anybody outside Newark care about it? To me, that's like saying why would anybody who doesn't live in outer space be interested in Star Wars? It's
Right, right.
a story about people and conflict and resolution and end of that conflict. So it applies just as much today as it did 50 years ago, and it applies in every city in this country just as much as it does to Newark.
So now, if the film is finished, which it seems like it is, and it's ready for distribution, which is already kind of set on some level on public TV, it's already in place, why do you need to find sponsors now?
Well, that's a very good question. Uh, And I'm saying sponsors, although PBS doesn't really let us call them sponsors, they're underwriters. It's
Oh,
the same thing basically. But
oh.
the reason that that happens is because in this kind of distribution, the producer gets absolutely zero from PBS. You get nothing. So your only
Hmm.
way to pay for things is to have backers sponsor it, whether it's a corporation or a foundation or individuals. And so there's a lot of those costs that need to be covered, like the news footage, the still photographs, the music. Plus,
Hmm.
I had quite a few people that worked on this for free with the assumption that someday they'll get paid, including me. I'd put 15 years in on this now, and I haven't
Oh, wow.
put a penny yet.
15 years you've been working on this?
14, actually. By the time we get to 2025, it'll be 15 years.
Wow. Someone yesterday or 2 days ago who's not in filmmaking and business asked me how long it takes to make a film. And I said, well, I guess like 1 year is kind of fast, but it seems to be like a 1 to 3 year run for nonfiction. But yes, for documentaries, I've heard it. I've heard this multiple times, over 10, 14 years.
Right, it takes a long time just to get you off the ground to begin with. But in a documentary like this, when there are specific people that you need to attract, for example, I started contacting mayors of Newark, whether it was the current mayor at the time I was shooting, current mayor was Cory Booker, and getting
Mhm.
through to a busy politician is always very tough. But then I went and tried to dig up people like previous mayors, like Mayor Gibson, who was mayor, the next mayor after the riots happened. And
Mm,
he's a guy who's an older man, and he didn't have an email address, and nobody even knew where he lived, and it took a lot of digging to find him. But I did, and I
right.
was so glad I did because he was one of those people who was at that age where he's not afraid to say anything. He didn't hold anything
Yeah.
back. He told exactly
Oh,
what he thought, and
yes.
he's one of about 8 or 9 people who are in the film who are now gone. So
Oh,
I was
wow.
lucky to get them in while they were available.
And your narrator also passed?
That's right. Unfortunately, Andre Brower passed with a great shock to me at the end
Huh.
of the past year. He had lung cancer, and
Oh,
but
okay.
he was a great asset to the film in many ways, not just his phenomenal voice, but he was actually the first African American person to see the whole film and offer
Mhm.
some feedback, some biases that I had that I wasn't even really aware of. So he was a great asset to the movie.
Now, I'd like to know how to become a sponsor, but one question before that. Now, according to the film website, riotthefilm.com, the producers of Riot decided to let all sides have their say and let viewers decide what they believe. instead of choosing sides. So, between me and you, let's be real, this is a private one-on-one here. Just kidding. Did you find yourself being pulled between conflicting points of view while producing or ping-ponging, like kind of going on one side and then flipping to another, or how did that go?
No, I think it was easy for me to understand how uh, different people had their different point of view. And for the most part, it was, the white people had one point of view and the black people had another. But
Interesting.
even beyond that, one of the National Guardsmen pointed out some really interesting things. Craig Mirop was a National Guardsman who had some incredible stories. And he said people asked him, how come you have all these stories and other people don't? Well, he just happened to be
Hmm.
standing on the right corner at the time when something happened. You could see a big fire or a murder or something on one corner, 2 blocks away, you wouldn't know about it. So it kind of depends on who you find that happens to see it from their point of view. He said he just
Right.
happens to be that guy who's next in line when the bank gets robbed. That his whole life has been like that. So I was lucky to find him too, as someone who not only witnessed things but remembers them in detail.
Yeah, I really want to get educated because before this, checked your website. I scoured YouTube a bit because I wasn't alive in 1967. I was born in 84. So where am I going to get information? And there's some online, but it seems like based on what you've said in your website, we're going to get a probably more nuanced look from you. So I really look forward to seeing your film Riot. Now, speaking of your film Riot, we have the whole time. What can I do if I want to become a sponsor?
Well, you can go to the website, riotthefilm.com,
Okay.
and there's a sponsorship page with 2 sections, one for corporations or um, larger scale sponsors who could be the ones with that 15-second announcement at the beginning and the end, or just an
Mhm.
individual who wants to give 5, 10, $100. You can get a tax deduction for that because we have a fiscal sponsorship through the Film Collaborative, so it counts as a charitable donation. So I'm hoping people will go there, and in the next few days, I hope we're going to have a spot running on cable TV in the general area, telling people about this and directing them to that website.
So this wasn't on my questions list, but riot or rebellion? What's the difference? How do you see this? Is it
That's
both?
that is a segment in the film where we discuss that controversy, one of many,
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
where people choose to call these kind of events by different names.
Hmm.
There is a feeling in the black activist community that calling it a riot kind of denigrates it and doesn't appreciate the angst behind it and the
Hmm.
legitimate reasons for protest that started it. I can appreciate that, but I also know that in my whole life, I have only ever heard people call it a riot. I never
Hmm.
heard that term rebellion until I started working on this film. And we have one of the great contributors to the film is Dr. Clement Price. He was the official historian of Newark, who puts it in an interesting way, saying that the people in America think of the Boston Tea Party as this great rise of discontent against the crown, but people in England
Hmm.
saw it as a riot. So
Ah,
it's all a
uh-huh.
matter of perspective, and I try to allow all perspectives in the film. So I would call the film riot because that's what people understand, and rebellion is discussed, and you get people in the film explaining why they prefer to call it that.
Do you think that news channels that covered this event were as, I guess, fair and unbiased as your documentary?
No, not at all, because back then it was a whole different uh, ball of wax in the social fabric of our country. There was really very little respect for people protesting and very little
Ah.
understanding of their problems and issues. So that was pretty one-sided on the favor of the police.
Now, you can see the trailer at riotthefilm.com. Where can listeners find out more about you, your other projects? Because you're not just a documentarian, you are a filmmaker, you're a producer, you do nonfiction. I believe you do commercials as well. We met at a film festival as quite artsy and not exactly nonfiction. So, yeah, give us your website and socials. Where can people find you?
On Facebook under my name.
Okay.
That's my only social media use. The website here is riotthefilm.com. As you said, I also have another site called renaissanceprods.com. It's renaissanceprods.com, where there's a more general look at the different kinds of things I'm doing.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Kevin McLaughlin. And if you want to spell that to find him on Facebook, it's Kevin, Kevin, McLaughlin. Like Laughlin. Thank you, Kevin McLaughlin. Looking forward to see your film. And any final thoughts for listeners on It Came from the Radio?
Thanks for having me. I hope that people will go to the website, check it out, keep an eye out for it. It's coming. It's going to be something that I hope opens a lot of minds and gets people thinking about how we relate to other people and how we avoid conflict as we go through life.
Avoiding conflicts, having solutions. Riot, the documentary, and now back to the studio, Mark Torres for more It Came from the Radio.